A door slammed shut, the impact reverberating through the walls and reaching Suguru's ears as the rush of footsteps to follow came and went. Pounding against the floor outside his dorm without any care for the others who shed in this building. Groaning, Suguru's neck fell to the side, just far enough to catch a glimpse of the alarm clock on his bedside table. No matter what time the red-lit numbers displayed, it was too early for someone else's impatience to dare wake him up from his sleep, if Suguru could even call it that. The inability to sleep wasn't the problem Suguru continued to face night after night. A proper, fulfilling rest remained out of his reach. His mind preoccupied with one too many thoughts. Too exhausted to string a coherent through line between them, only serving as a pointless distraction than any means to cultivate an eye-opening revelation in the witching hours of the night. Suguru's head had collided with his unsupportive pillow and his eyes had closed shut. Intent on tossing and turning all night until but mercy in the form of his body finally giving out under the weight of overtaxed limbs and a desperate need to shut down took him under. Now awake, all Suguru could do was lie in bed and endure the taunting of being unable to return to such a state. Not that it appeared to do him any good. His pained arms and legs took ample energy to move. Energy that had not been replenished. The migraine from last night still pulsated under his forehead, growing more prominent anytime he shut his eyes tight or turned his head. How deceitful was it for others to claim rest held rejuvenating properties when all it did was worsen Suguru's state in such a way he had to spend much of his morning recovering just to start his day. Current circumstances only magnified Suguru's ordeal further. If he hadn't been disturbed by the noise outside, Suguru would have attempted to convince himself, as futile an effort that would be, that the day prior had been nothing more than a fever dream. Stress could have been the blame, what a cop-out it was these days, but really, the chances of him deluding himself into such denial were minuscule. Suguru saw the two time travelers with his own eyes, heard their tale with his own ears, and felt the very energy that radiated off them knock against his own. There was no more denying the words they were speaking. A truth so unbelievable Suguru had to remove himself from it. To go against his very nature, to push back and scrutinize each detail as a potential falsehood just to accept the absurdity for what it was. A future on the verge of falling apart. Another set of footsteps, slower, more considerate, shuffled past Suguru's door. Given who was currently on campus and who had already vacated the building, Habara or Ijichi was responsible for the noise. Normally the order in which the students woke up would have been in reverse. Months, now years, of living on the same grounds left everyone with a routine of their own. Ever the impatient one, tradition would not get in Satoru's way. Perhaps it was time for Suguru to get up as well. Shoving himself off the bed took a fair bit of effort, but with enough determination, Suguru now sat on the edge of his mattress with his feet against the ground. All that was left to do was stand up and start his routine, but all he could do was allow his shoulders to slouch. And his hair fall forward with the entangled mess urging him to move so that he may fix it. Suguru refused. Sukuna's incarnation. Satoru's ceiling. The culling game. Events that should not have occurred, will not occur if the right choices were made to avoid it. Who was to say what the right choices are? What path led to salvation? What actions granted a favorable outcome? And whose decisions would lead to an even greater calamity? Make no mistake, Suguru did not wish for the future Itadori described to unfold a second time. It would be rather petty of him to consider it, but there was so much missing information that Suguru could not display the same optimism and confidence Satoru smothered himself in. It must be so easy, knowing the future that would have awaited you. Selfishly, each time Itadori and that curse brother of his described the events they had been separated from, Suguru waited with bated breath to hear his name. The incident in Shibuya had not only required Satoru's involvement, but another special grade sorcerer as well. And then a supposed third, with the arrival of the second-year student Akotsu. With events unfolding the likes of which their era has never seen, it would be obvious to assume that all sorcerers were working to contain it. Suguru should have been there. But not once did his name come up. Why would that be the case? What circumstances would have kept him out of Itadori's recollection of events? He was almost inclined to consider it purposeful, if his own rising anxiety of the truth he was so desperate for wasn't threatening to gut him through upon receiving it. For what reason had the mere mention of his name become taboo? There were plenty of reasons. The specifics were what mattered. Like Satoru before him, Suguru first assumed he was dead or had faced death during the incident in Shibuya. Death was not an easy subject. To break the news of another's death taking place far sooner than the lifetime one would hope to experience was a harrowing conversation in of itself. To wish to hide that knowledge, to spare others from mourning a life cut short when their own now had the potential to supersede it fit well into Suguru's understanding of Itadori. It did not, however, completely align with the animosity in Itadori's eyes. Such a reaction, especially when paired with the familiarity and fondness the younger teenager had for Satoru, continued to catch Suguru off guard. With a number of explanations to explain why Itadori's negative disposition remained so strong. Suguru found himself growing sicker with each one he humored enough to consider how it held up alongside the facts he had received so far. What had the Suguru of Itadori's time done to deserve such hate? He wanted a clear answer to put this speculation of its misery. Yet, as hypocritical as it was, Suguru did not wish to hear said answer at all. Confirming his suspicions would not necessarily bring him peace. This was the future, his future. As much as Suguru would prefer to break himself away from the Suguru of the future, they were technically still one and the same. Or has Itadori's appearance altered that? Was any of this as clear-cut as Satoru made it seem? Was there anything for Suguru to fear at all? What was the opinion of one person, a vessel, within the grand scheme of life? Suguru found himself struggling to breathe in the confines of his dorm. A sudden push was all he needed to shove himself off the bed, eyes fixated on the door to his bathroom as nausea worked its way up his throat, only to be forcefully shoved back down. Clean up. Look presentable. Get out. The teenager stripped, showered, and dried in record time, rushing the process to avoid any more unwelcome thoughts traipsing through his head. After tying his hair too tight with not enough care to rip the hairband out and try again, Suguru forced the rest of his clothes on and rushed out the door. Coming to a halt the moment he was about to pick up speed as someone stood in his path to the last remaining barrier between him and the outside air he so desperately craved. Nanami, you're back. Gito-senpai, the aforementioned second year nodded his head, acknowledging Suguru's presence while his hand remained steady against the Habara's door. This is unfortunate, Habara requested that he be the first to know when I arrived, but he's not answering. I better not get blamed for this. Suguru couldn't help but shake his head. Nanami and Habara's relationship was odd. Being the only students in their year upon arrival, it made sense that the two would be close. They didn't have much of a choice, but the differences in personality were striking. Habara had enthusiasm to rival Satoru's at times with an unwavering sense of optimism. A real socialite who had no trouble approaching others. Nanami was pragmatic, reserved, and kept to himself when given the choice. His focus was set on his work and his studies, yet at Habara's suggestion, it was quite easy for Nanami to deviate from his routine to make room for his classmates' plans. Case in point, Nanami was still carrying his bags, his weapon slumped over his shoulder as he passed his own dorm to reach Habara's first. You just missed him. I believe it was Habara who passed my door earlier. If I had to guess. He went to the dining hall already. Nanami finished Suguru's sentence for him while checking his watch. I'll drop my things off and go catch up with him then. I assume this means his mission was successful? No injuries? No lasting ones, Suguru clarified as he followed the second year down the hall. The two stopped at Nanami's dorm, with the older teenager waiting in the doorway as his underclassman took care of his things. Shoko made sure of that. I know Habara will tell you all about it, but did you know they mislabeled the third grade he was sent to exorcise? It was a semi-second grade. Shit, the curse echoed into the hall before Nanami could return, his things tossed aside to be dealt with at a later time. He shouldn't be. I told them splitting us up was a poor decision. Especially now. This is the second time I've had to deal with a mislabeled cursed spirit in the past 3 months. The ranking system is as old as this school. Identifying cursed spirits should not allow this much room for error. Are you accusing the higher-ups of being incompetent? Would that be worse than claiming they are doing this on purpose? Nanami scowled underneath the hand rubbing his temples. Everyone has been overworked more than usual. Overwork leads to errors in judgment. But in our line of work, we can't afford errors. That costs the lives of sorcerers and non-sorcerers alike. They need to do better. When the two approached the doors leading outside, Nanami went first to hold the door open for Suguru behind him. That I can agree with. If it's any consolation, I haven't received word on any new assignments yet. We might be entering a lull period if I didn't just jinx it. The older teenager raised his hand and half-heartedly knocked on the wood of the door frame as he passed underneath it. Gito-senpai, if you're going to make the attempt to be optimistic, the least you could do is try to believe the words you are saying. And here Suguru thought he was putting on a convincing act. You got me, Suguru shrugged. As long as cursed spirits exist, as long as monkeys exist, a sorcerer's work was never done. The missions are never ending. There is no light at the end of this tunnel. Just work until the day you die. Sounds like an office job. Only those provide guaranteed vacation days. The path split only a few steps from the building. Nanami had already veered right, coming to a stop only when he sensed Suguru's hesitation to follow him. Will you not be joining us? Later, Suguru had lost his appetite weeks ago. Necessity drove him to eat, but he could avoid it longer if he wished. I have something else to attend to first. A blatant lie. Suguru had nowhere to be. While he supposed that following up on the events of last night was a necessary task, his reluctance to dive into such discussion willfully led him to wander elsewhere. If only to avoid the inevitable just a bit longer. I understand. Be sure to avoid waiting too long. You'll make extra trouble for the rest of us if we have to drag your body back. The second year was difficult to read. Always attentive, even if he didn't care to show it in the traditional sense. I'll keep that in mind. I would hate to inconvenience any of you. Suguru walked away before any more attempts could be made to convince him of backing out from his decision. Yet, as far away as Suguru got from his underclassmen, Nanami's word managed to keep pace alongside him. They need to do better. The system, the elders, didn't need to do better. They needed to be uprooted from the ground and burned away entirely. But by Itadori's word, Jujutsu Society hadn't changed in the time between now and his sending first years against a special grade. Sure, it was a cursed wound when reported, but they should have known it would produce a special grade in time. And to be forced to turn to Ryomen Sukuna for aid. Nanami had mostly accused the higher-ups of such incompetency being a purposeful act in jest, but in Itadori's case, he was hand-picked for that mission. Suguru was sure of it. The elders wanted Sukuna dead. A mission devolving into something beyond their students' control. That was one way to go about getting around Satoru's watchful eye without forcing their direct hand. The elders would claim ignorance. Then mercy. Itadori wouldn't have to suffer through being a vessel any longer, all the while knowing full well what strings they had pulled to ensure all the pieces fell just right. The thought alone disgusted him. Suguru was left to wonder how Itadori hadn't sought to lash out for such actions. If everything Itadori spoke of was true, he not only continued on as a sorcerer but swayed someone higher up to provide a recommendation to be tested for the sorcerer rank of first grade. Even if earned, Suguru doubted the elders would go through and acknowledge it. Why continue working as a sorcerer when all that awaited him was death? If not by the cursed spirits he fought, then by the very allies he worked alongside with an impatient faction unwilling to wait until the last finger was found and swallowed. Living out of spite was the first answer that came to mind, but Suguru quickly dismissed it, his own mindset muddling his conclusion on someone who did not fit the explanation. The next thought to follow, however, fit all too well. A sense of obligation. Just as Itadori knew he was the only one who could suppress Sukuna, there was no reason that mindset didn't bleed into everything else he did. To warn them of what was to come in hopes of saving the lives he already lost when no one else possessed the same chance. What difference was there in fighting cursed spirits when knowing it was only those who could possess and wield cursed energy were able to do so? Suguru wanted to laugh. And he almost did. With no one around, laughing at the air wouldn't do any harm to Suguru's crumbling image. He'd done well to hide his deterioration the best he could, but the signs were becoming more apparent as time went on. Then again, his care for how others saw him was slowly falling to the wayside as well. It was only a matter of time before he stopped caring entirely. His death was your fault, brat. Suguru's feet came to a halt before his mind could register the unknown voice that chilled his veins and sent his nerves into a frenzy. The top of his body worked to catch itself before he could stumble further down one of the many paths he'd turned down on a mindless whim while preoccupied with a brain trapped in perpetual thought. Forced to look up and peer into the present world, Suguru's eyes gazed upon a scene he had not been prepared to stumble across only meters ahead of him. Far from the main buildings, Itadori sat alone on the bench propped up against the edge of the stonework at their feet. His legs folded tight against his chest, hands holding them in place. Suguru was left to rely on his peripheral vision to confirm that both Satoru and the curse usually by Itadori's side were truly absent. His focus remained on the additional mouth of jagged teeth breaking through the younger teenager's cheek, poking out where Itadori's face could not when buried in his knees. Sukuna, in the flesh of another. I wonder how he'll die this time. Warped amusement laced the curse's voice. You don't honestly believe you'll prevent it, do you? Shut up. Itadori's muffled growl escaped into the air. It's not going to happen, I'm going to stop it. Nanamin, Nanami won't. It won't happen. Nanami's dead. Suguru's heart accelerated as his mind rewound through the encounter he just had with his underclassmen. Impossible. They just spoke. He would have felt the energy shift in the air. Nanami would not go down so easily, signs of a battle would have shown themselves. Rationale soon caught up with Suguru's mental spiral. Itadori wasn't referring to, despairing over, Suguru's Nanami, but his. Stuck in place, trapped in the pocket of silence that followed Itadori's words, Suguru did not know what he should do. Itadori was alone. Common sense told him he shouldn't leave the vessel of Sukuna alone like this. What little sympathy he still had ushered him to say something, but whatever options he had stuttered in his throat. Humans die. Sorcerers die. More often than not, cursed spirits were to blame. That's a troublesome curse you're stuck with. Itadori jolted upward as soon as Suguru spoke, wobbling in his seat as he slammed a hand against Sukuna's mouth, ignoring the pain it would bring to his cheek. Gito-san, the younger teenager stammered, hastily wiping the trails of tears still present on his face where his pants did not soak them up. It was when both hands were occupied with the task did Suguru see Itadori's cheek return to its blank state. He only comes out at the worst times. Mostly just talks in my head, if he talks at all. Not that I ever want to hear what he has to say. Suguru wasn't blind to the possibility that Sukuna's suppression did not equate to being sealed off from the world completely. Communication between the two was to be expected, but for Sukuna to appear now, seemingly to voice the intrusive thoughts Itadori already dealt with, was no different from pouring salt into an open wound. To do so now for all to hear, it was clear their relationship truly was of mutual destruction. If not the body, then the mind. Does he speak to you often? Suguru braced himself and took a step forward. Then another, until he was dangerously close to approaching Itadori's seat. Not always. Recently he's gotten more interested in what's going on, but he can't do anything. I promise he's just all talk. Suguru gestured for Itadori to stop. It's fine. The older teenager left it at that, going against his own instincts to sit on the half of the bench Itadori left empty. Only when he sat down did Suguru feel the tension in his legs, his muscles giving out the moment they weren't needed in search of structure to hold themselves steady. There was no going back now. I heard about Nanami, it should have been obvious, but Itadori's eyes still widened at Suguru's admittance. The younger teenager remained still in his seat, waiting for Suguru to follow up on his previous statement. Were you too close? Had he known such a simple question would open the floodgates to so much more, Suguru still would have asked. Curiosity was pervasive like that. Yeah. Nanami was, Itadori swallowed, working hard to regain his composure. I never got to tell him this, but he was the closest thing to a dad I ever had. Oh. That was not what Suguru was expecting to hear. As he'd learned of future Satoru's and Itadori's relationship, Suguru thought it safe to assume that Nanami may have held a similar role, not as a teacher but as another senior sorcerer to turn to. Or at the very least, held a positive relationship with Itadori to warrant his mourning. Never once did Suguru consider their relationship to be a quasi-familial one. Nanami never appeared to be the type to tolerate children. I know it's weird, as I said yesterday, I never knew my parents. The old man, my grandfather, did his best. And I'll never complain about how he raised me, but when I met Nanami, I finally felt like I had missed out on something. Itadori's chest rose and fell. The edges of his sleeves were pulled down into his hands, tucked under his fingers to make wiping his face easier. He was my mentor. I didn't think we'd get along at first, being so different from sensei. Nanami's so serious, yet unbelievably kind all the same. Did you? No, you wouldn't know. Know what? Suguru forced his voice to remain soft, fighting back the immediate demand for further explanation behind a gentle nudge, hoping that would yield better results. Nanami left. A couple of years back, I don't know the details, he quit being a sorcerer. Worked as a salaryman for a while. Sensei even introduced me to him as the ex-salaryman sorcerer the first time we met. God, Nanami was so annoyed with him. Nanamin. 3 times Itadori had referred to Nanami as that, leaving Suguru to assume it was some kind of nickname. He left, and then came back. Why? No one just walks away from the jujutsu world without fighting tooth and nail for it. Especially a sorcerer as capable as Nanami. To go through all that trouble only to return would only make the original act pointless. He said, being a sorcerer was shit. Being a salaryman was also shit. Since both were equally shit, he'd take the less shitty one. Itadori's head fell into his lap, rising back high enough to grip his face. For his fingers to press against the scar down its center. He shouldn't have come back. The tears didn't stop. He's dead. A cursed spirit, Mahito, killed him right there, right in front of me, and I couldn't do a damn thing. I should have gotten there sooner. I should have saved him. It shouldn't have happened again. You got him good, right? Took care of the guy responsible? No, I didn't. He got away. Why did Itadori remind him so much of Satoru when he cried? The same fat tears. The same choking between breaths, repressed until the very last moment. A flash of white overtook Suguru's vision, replacing Itadori's form with another for no less than a second. Reach out. Don't leave him like this. Those thoughts carried Suguru's hand across the gap between them. Intent on holding Itadori's shoulder as he had with Satoru, the only thing he knew how to do in a situation such as this, praying it would work all the same. It didn't. Contact broke so fast, Suguru was left to question if he even touched Itadori at all. The younger teenager did more than just flinch. He scrambled back only as far as the bench would allow before his back hit the railing. Itadori was afraid, angered, bewildered. A wild mix of the three that left Suguru to retreat back into his own space, unsure what he had done wrong until it hit him that the action itself wasn't the blame, but the person performing it. Dropping his elbows onto his knees, Suguru slouched forward as he accepted the facts before him. But why does Itadori look at him like that? Why does it bother him so much? Suguru shoved his turmoil aside, choosing to address Itadori's original outburst in favor of leaving the current one unresolved. Only for a little longer. Sorcerers die. More often than not, sorcerers die fighting cursed spirits. The words almost spoke themselves, using Suguru as nothing more than a mouthpiece until he registered his own voice in the air. Nanami knew that when he returned. Suguru mourned Itadori's loss as much as one could when hearing about a future that had yet to transpire. Proof or not, each story told of a time outside their reach felt distant, hollow, yet loomed over their shoulders all the same. His grief, as shallow as it felt, did not reveal itself through the unwavering frown plastered on his face. Itadori broke down enough for the both of them. It shouldn't have happened. I should have saved him. You're right. Nanami shouldn't have died. But I fail to see how you're to blame for it. A cursed spirit, created by the twisted conscience of monkeys, took Nanami away from them. Unless Itadori had delivered the finishing blow, it was not his fault to bear. Should have and could have are two very different things. Just because you should have done something, does not mean you could have. Then again, I wasn't a witness to the event, so take from that what you will. The younger teenager beside him contemplated his words, quick to mumble incoherently under his breath until his breathing returned to its proper place and sentences could be formed again. Just above a whisper. Nanami said, his last words were, "You got it from here." How could he say that after everything after? Itadori's words trailed off. He shut his eyes right, shaking his head before working himself up into another round of grief. I heard him. In the dining hall. That's him. That's his voice. He's alive, and I can't bring myself to look at him. Itadori turned to Suguru, his eyes looking down at their feet, unable to make contact. You're as strong as Sensei, right? Wrong. Satoru surpassed him months ago. Satoru does have a habit of saying that. Suguru's refusal to commit to a solid answer was good enough to be accepted. Then, can I ask you something? They were already talking. Whatever Itadori was about to ask must be beyond a simple question. He wanted something from him. Something would be left unanswered unless Suguru engaged further. Sure, ask away. Okay. Itadori uncurled his legs, dropping his feet to the ground to allow himself to straighten his back. The courage to look Suguru in the eyes had shown itself. I know I said I have everything under control, and I know Sensei said he'd take care of things if something happened, but if anything does happen and Sukuna takes over, can you kill me? What are? You do know what you're asking, don't you? I can't lose anyone else. Not again. And definitely not to him. I don't think, I know, Chozo won't do it. He'd rather subdue Sukuna in hopes I resurface. Sensei would try to do the same. He wouldn't take Sukuna seriously. And I'm afraid, I need to make sure Sukuna doesn't get a chance to hurt anyone else. Itadori had the audacity to force a smile too painful to look at despite its purpose to put the older teenager at ease. Don't get me wrong, I meant what I said yesterday. I really don't want to die just yet, not with the hell we left behind. But if Sukuna gets out, and it means keeping everyone else safe, this future safe from him, I can't afford to be selfish. Suguru did not divert his eyes. In fact, all he could do was stare. How could Itadori ask this of him? The very questions Suguru had shoved aside returned to him in droves. How does Itadori perceive him to be able to follow through with that? Was it because of his reaction last night? Or was it ingrained in memories older than that? To trust him with such a morbid failsafe when sitting here was a cause for discomfort. When both Itadori and his cursed spirit looked at him with such contempt. Too personal to be ignored. Even now, as relaxed as they appeared to be on the surface, unease plagued their silent exchange as Suguru had yet to provide an answer. Please, Gito-san. What did I do? Suguru couldn't hold himself back any longer. What happened in your future that you can't look at me the same way you look at him? What did I do to you? Barely audible, Itadori's reaction was accompanied by a quick shift in his eyes, his head turning back to the dining hall he'd fled from. Perhaps contemplating if it was worth making a run for it over having to face a subject he'd chosen to ignore. Ultimately, Itadori did not run. But his reluctance to answer immediately only served to further carve the gaping feeling in Suguru's chest. Crossing his arms, Itadori tucked his hands out of sight before returning his focus to the person beside him. You, and Sensei got into a fight. We do that sometimes. But this wasn't like that. Itadori shook his head. I'm sorry, I don't know enough to tell you what happened. It was before I enrolled, and You know enough to be angry, but not enough to tell me why. Suguru flew to his feet, fists forming at his sides as he stood over the teenager before him. He was shouting now. Is that it? Before Satoru's ceiling. Is that why it happened? Was Suguru truly not there to help stop it? The younger teenager's mouth hung open, mocking Suguru with the potential for further elaboration, closing much too quickly after nothing came out. You're not going to say it, are you? I don't want to make things worse if I do. The bench was abandoned as Itadori rose to his feet, facing forward while refusing to confront Suguru directly. I'm sorry, Gito-san. I don't. I should have tried harder to, I'm not. Itadori fell over, clutching his side as he caught himself with his knees before the rest of his body hit the ground. Shaking, hyperventilating, caught in a panic, he struggled to grasp the bench seat behind him to lift himself up, his hand missing with each consecutive attempt. Guilt struck Suguru as he watched, already filling in the pieces Itadori left blank with cruel assumptions of his own. He knew better than to jump to the extremes, but he could only confirm or deny what Itadori's future held with the younger teenager's cooperation. But all he did was drive Itadori further into anguish when he was barely holding it together as it was. The knowledge of the potential to come was not a miracle, but a burden. Another weight to carry on Itadori's shoulders as he worked to decide what needed to be changed, what should stay the same. His perception of events was not perfect. His information was not all-encompassing. Despite this, Itadori's decisions were not made on a whim, but by the calculations he could make with what he had. It was through understanding that could Suguru scrape any more progress from their talk. Itadori, I'm not around in your future either, and Suguru dropped his fists, stepping closer to the younger teenager to kneel down by his side. You don't have to tell me what that means right now, I can wait. I only ask that you tell me if I'm right, okay? Everything else, we will talk about it later when you're ready. It's complicated. Itadori gave up on climbing back onto the bench. But, you're not wrong. There was relief in that confirmation, though Suguru couldn't decide whether he should be elated to feel that way or not. How about we agree to keep this between us for now? And while the ground may be very appealing, you should probably head back to Satoru and your brother before they tear apart the campus looking for you. Satoru should be the one by Itadori's side. He'd be better suited for it. I can do that. The first thing, I don't know if I can go back just yet. We can drag our feet as we walk. Suguru received a look of confusion on Itadori's face, to which he addressed as he ushered the both of them to stand. It would be irresponsible to let Sukuna's vessel walk around unsupervised. Yaga-sensei would have Satoru's head. Okay. This appeared to get Itadori to follow his lead, reluctant to stand, though he was determined to do so once Satoru's well-being was put at risk. As if Yaga would actually do that to him. Suguru had to slow his pace even further to compensate for the difference in distance of their individual steps covered. His longer legs shortening the journey when both himself and Itadori were content to remain within the silence a bit longer, neither teenager eager to reach their destination. Are you going inside too? Itadori asked as they stopped at the building's edge, both lingering just far enough to avoid being heard through the open door he must have left behind when he fled. Would you prefer I didn't? No, you haven't eaten yet. His eyes were looking at Suguru's hair, still damp from his shower. Everyone should have at least something to eat in the morning. Itadori's words rang empty when they weren't able to apply to himself. The very idea of eating made the younger teenager look nauseous, and the same feeling mirrored itself within Suguru's stomach. Neither was here for the food. I'll go in to make sure Satoru knows to keep a better eye on you. That is all. What Suguru needed was a distraction as he endured the time he granted Itadori to prepare himself for their talk. But when everything around him was nothing but a reminder of all he wished to avoid, there was truly no hope in finding one here. Still, Suguru walked forward regardless. Notes. This is the shortest chapter so far, but I do plan for a lot to happen next chapter, so I think it evens out. I really am playing myself here as I write these updates because I am slowly writing Nanami and Haibara in more and more, not a bad thing at all, I just love the supporting cast so much and their presence is important to the narrative, so, no shame here. Notes. A shout out to Satoru for waking everyone up this morning. Nanami and Haibara's dynamic as a duo is so much fun, I can't wait to write them both when they are actually in the scene together. Teenager Nanami is so serious but will drop everything as Haibara asks him to. Plus, both him and Suguru getting all protective over Haibara is sweet. I really wish the manga had more time in the past arc just to see these dynamics unfold. I had something to say about Yuji and Suguru, but I swear, a lot of my notes are just post-chapter ramblings. My brain stops working once I get ready to upload, so I'll probably go off in a comment or edit this later if it comes back to me in a more coherent manner. Edit. I remembered, Yuji asking Suguru about handling Sukuna invokes the same scene in which he asks Yuta to do the same before they depart Shibuya. Purposely left unresolved, Yuji isn't blind to the attachment his sensei's younger self seems to have for him. On top of Sukuna's own declaration of possibly fighting and attempting to kill Satoru again, it's safe to say he needs all the assurances he can get. Just as Suguru wants a clear answer to what happened to his future self, Yuji will want a clear answer of Suguru's willingness to follow through with his request. This was also the hardest chapter to end, mostly because I didn't want it to end so soon, but I require a different POV for what happens next and after going through the outline. This is where the best point to shift gears was. Thank you all so much for reading. Your feedback fuels the soul. See you all next chapter.